Hi guys, it is Tamra. Thank you so much for coming back to my channel. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the traumatic incidents that we fail to recognize as traumatic. And as a matter of fact, there are quite a few issues that we do not tend to recognize as emotionally and psychologically traumatic. And I think that's just because we lack knowledge about what truly is trauma. So let's not waste any more time. Let's just go ahead and start. So thank you so much for coming back to my channel. For all of you who are subscribed and participating, thank you so much. As I always say to you guys are wonderful. And for those who are new to this channel, I encourage you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can stick around with us and be a part of our growing and validating community. And in case you don't know who I am, let me go ahead and briefly introduce myself. My name is Tamra, and I'm an internationally and board certified trauma therapist, but I'm also a licensed therapist in private practice who works with children, teens, and families. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's just start by looking at the traumatic incidents of January 6th, which would have been last Wednesday. Yeah, last Wednesday. And, you know, that was the political storm at Capitol Hill. You know, this is a topic that I'm trying to be a little bit careful about mentioning because it's such a fiery topic right now. But how can I be a trauma-informed channel if I don't look at the traumatic impact of this particular event? And, you know, the more I think about it, the more I realize that, wait a minute, I can't do that. I cannot be a trauma-based channel and not mention something that is going to go down in history as a traumatic situation. I think a lot of people will agree that what happened last Wednesday is historical. And not only is it historical, but it's rather traumatic in the sense that it was a mob. It was a riot. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't anything necessarily productive. The mob and the riot became violent and deadly, and that is traumatic. A lot of people who are on the left, or they are Democrats, or the conservatives, some conservatives, you know, it gets a little bit tricky, and people define themselves differently. You know, they look at it as a traumatic incident that's going to go down in history. Is quite shocking. The right, however, and not all, but some, maybe most, see it as a situation that needed to happen. And I disagree with that. But on top of that, I also am not certain why this topic has not been brought up as traumatic. I think it's traumatic not only for children who may have seen that, but for the families who lost loved ones or whose loved ones are now out of work because they're injured. And I also think it was traumatic for children. I can't imagine the thoughts and the feelings that a child would have watching the news. I honestly think that, you know, when the news comes on and the riot mob is flicked on or turned on, and, you know, it's showing replays of people getting hurt and injured and bullied and threatened, you know, I feel like the child needs to be removed from the room just so that they don't hear that and see that. It's emotionally and psychologically traumatic. You know, aside from what happened on Capitol Hill, which is disheartening to say the least, I think there's a couple of other things that we need to mention, that I need to mention, I should say. And I think you might agree that these are traumatic situations. So let me start with the first thing. I think that there's a lot of trauma that underlies racial trauma. That's number one. That's a traumatic situation for a lot of people of color. Now, I can safely say for myself, being of mixed or multi-ethnic descent, that I have experienced racial trauma on every level growing up. And unfortunately, I still do as a woman of color, as an educated woman of color who's an entrepreneur, and as a multi-ethnic individual. So I don't quite fit in, and that can cause racial trauma. There's another side of this as well, which is intergenerational racial trauma. And basically what's happening there is, you know, way back, our ancestors dealt with slavery and prejudice and discrimination, and it impacted them emotionally. And so they pass it on, and they transfer it onto younger generations through their attitudes, their beliefs, their behaviors, and that creates trauma. Racial trauma can also result from watching the news and seeing repeated incidents that are similar to the racialized incidents of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, amongst a variety of individuals who were just like them in years past. We can also look at racial trauma as being a trauma that occurs because you're living in a neighborhood that is segregated, and you're going to a school that's segregated, and you're working in a workplace that's segregated, and you're dealing with those internal feelings every day of not being enough and being inadequate and being short-circuited. So that is racial trauma, right? The next kind of trauma that we tend to minimize or we ignore is emotional incest. Now, emotional incest is basically the idea that, you know, you're violating the emotional space of the other individual. And this can happen in a romantic relationship. It can also happen in a parent relationship, or it can also happen in a work-based relationship. It can happen in any relationship where there's a power differential, okay? And the individual who's on the top or has the most power really exploits you emotionally. And so that's emotional incest. That can be traumatic. Just as sexual incest is traumatic, emotional incest can be just as traumatic, because it's taking somebody's emotions and manipulating them and suffocating them and really disregarding their thoughts and their feelings in relation to, you know, life and things and your requests of them, right? So emotional incest can definitely be traumatic, and I talk about that right up here in this video, so go ahead and take a look at that. You might find that video quite interesting to this topic. Okay, the next thing, guys, is emotional unavailability of parents. That's the best way I can put it. Emotional unavailability of parents. I talk about that right up here in this video, so you can go ahead and check that out. It's emotionally traumatizing and very psychologically destabilizing to have a parent who's emotionally unavailable and unable to give of themselves to you. That means that you're going to be on your own for a lot of things, whether that's being on your own with schoolwork and peers and teachers and school pressures, or being on your own with life. Maybe you're having problems with your spouse. Maybe you're having, you know, trouble at work, and you need your mother, or you need that parent to really step up and be support for you, but they can't do it because they're emotionally unavailable. Just having to navigate life around that can be psychologically and emotionally traumatizing. All right, guys. The next thing is PTSD associated with being a veteran. I have a lot of veterans that watch my channel, and thank you so much for your service for those of you who are watching. I have both women and men who are veterans that watch the channel because it's a trauma-based channel. Well, let me just speak up for you right now, because I think a lot of people in the United States tend to minimize or ignore unintentionally the benefits that you provide for us. The reason we can get up every day and enjoy our coffee and our breakfast and go to bed at night is because you fight for us. And so, you know, it's really sad to think that we have left you out in the cold. A lot of veterans end up homeless after they come back to the United States. They end up on substances like meth and Adderall and over-the-counter medications and controlled substances, marijuana, crack cocaine, the list goes on, and they don't have the insurance or the ability to get the treatment that they need. So they end up left behind. And if they don't end up homeless, then they end up in a rehab with very little insurance options available to them. So the United States has done you as a veteran no justice whatsoever. And I'm just sorry that has happened. But I will say that, you know, the trauma that veterans experience is something that we tend to ignore. Again, unintentionally. I don't think citizens in the United States would intentionally ignore the needs of veterans, but they're just unaware of it because it's not right in front of them on a daily basis. They ignore that sacrifice. That's the word I'm looking for. They ignore that sacrifice that you you know, you give us. So that is emotionally destabilizing as well. All right. The next traumatic situation, guys, would be police and law enforcement trauma. You know, even though law enforcement can be a little tricky and it's politically charged in today's society, and, you know, everybody who's a law enforcement officer or police officer or an FBI agent is not acting in the what am I trying to say? They're not acting in the benefit or the best interests of society. Sometimes they are very, very wrong, and they do things that are wrong, and they should not have a badge or any access to law enforcement privileges, right? But the ones who are great and wonderful, and I've met so many of them, they're so sweet and so humbling to have them fight for us, right? And they're so humble too, some of them. They're just sweet people and they just want to help. Those individuals see a lot on a daily basis. They deal with the criminals that we don't have to see, those of us who are not law enforcement, right? They, you know, they go in and rescue people, and they go into homes that are not livable, they're deplorable. They arrest people. Sometimes they're injured and severely injured on the job, right? They go through a lot. They have to shoot guns all the time, and, you know, they have to really be careful and watch themselves so they can go home to their families at the end of the day or at the end of the shift, right? So they deal with a lot as well. And a lot of police officers and law enforcement deal with PTSD. And unfortunately, they don't always go to counseling because they think that that's a slight to their high status position. So a lot of them suffer emotionally on their own. And that's a trauma that we fail to recognize as society. That needs to stop, of course. And all of these things, that all of these traumatic situations, right, guys, that we tend to minimize or we don't look at, needs to change. All right. The next thing that's traumatic is, you know, trauma that's associated with the helping professions, right? Myself as a psychotherapist, I've seen so much, and psychiatrists, they see a lot. You know, even medical doctors, I can even throw them in there as well. We tend to ignore the trauma that these particular professions, the helping professions, the medical field, the field of psychology has to deal with. For me, before I got into private practice, I worked in a variety of places: schools, community centers, residential treatment facilities, rehab programs, juvenile delinquency centers, you know, delinquent holding places. I worked in a variety of settings working with families and children and adolescents, and there were times when I had to stand back and watch kids being held down and drugged, watch kids throwing feces at staff and urinating on their beds and on their furniture in their rooms. I've seen kids handcuffed and shackled. I've also been a part of restraints with kids where the staff have to restrain a kid. I have seen some pretty intense things, and it can be very, very traumatizing. Medical doctors have to do surgeries. They lose people to death that they thought they could save. So they deal with a lot of traumatic situations as well. And we can walk away with post-traumatic stress disorder or compassion fatigue, which I'll talk about in this video right up here, and not even know it. So that's something else that we tend to minimize or we don't really look at. The next thing and the last thing is parental trauma. And what I mean by that is women who are struggling with childbirth or have brought a stillborn baby into the world, has lost a baby. Also parents who, you know, have lost their child to murder or kidnapping, a parent who has found out that their child is being sexually abused or molested, sexual incest that the parent found out about. All of those things can be traumatic for parents. Parents deal with a lot of traumatic situations as well, but they don't have services that are catered towards them or specialized for them. So I'm sure a lot of parents don't believe that they're traumatized, but a lot of times when they're in these particular situations that I just mentioned, they begin to have symptoms of PTSD, whether they recognize it or not. So these are all situations, guys, that can really traumatize us and cause us to walk away with PTSD or some kind of acute stress disorder or acute trauma. It's important to understand what these things are so that we can look at ourselves and people that we love and people that we know and be able to point out when they need support and help. Thank you so much for being here today, guys, with me in this video. I encourage you to give it a thumbs up if it was helpful, and go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can stick around with us and get those updates. I'm really, really grateful and excited about what's on the new horizon, what's coming up. I promise to keep you guys updated. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon in the next video. Bye.